your blue mountain. Just give me strength to climb.
Good evening. My name is Salvador Carrasco, and I'm a film professor here at Santa Monica College. Tonight, we are invited to witness a living, breathing historical document, an intimate portrait of a man, an American, an African American, a global citizen who helped define our modern era. It is also the portrait of a human being in transition after being forged and tempered by the times he lived in. The name alone of Martin Luther King Jr. evokes immediate, illuminating images akin to when we hear the title of a film that has changed us forever. King's memory is universally celebrated for the immortal I Have a Dream speech in Washington and his calls for nonviolent resistance to segregation. But the socially conscious king, the king who condemned the economic inequalities and foreign policy of his country, the king who spoke in solidarity with the restless third world, is often shunned by the presidents and public officials who invoke his name every January 15th, since Ronald Reagan reluctantly declared King's birthday a national holiday while still acknowledging publicly that secret FBI files might prove one day that King was a communist sympathizer rather than a loyal American. Tonight, we will not be recounting a myth. We have been invited to sit down with a Martin Luther King rarely seen outside of the usual samples of documentaries and TV specials. In December 1965, our distinguished guest, filmmaker George Silano, and producer and interviewer Arnold Michaelis spent 4 days with Dr. King and his wife, Coretta Scott King, in their Atlanta, Georgia home to converse about life, family, and the raging storms that defined the 1960s. By the time of this interview, King had already led the March on Washington and been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He had seen President Lyndon Johnson sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act was already on its way to becoming a reality a few months later in August 1966. These two laws essentially marked the end of official legislated racism in the United States, at least on paper, if not actualized on the ground. By any measure, King had already attained a solid status as a key leader of the African American struggle for equality. He achieved this through an elegant and disciplined belief in the power of nonviolent struggle expressed in events such as the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham campaign against racial segregation, and the Selma voting rights marches. But by late 1965, convulsions were gathering force both at home and abroad that challenged King not only to evolve and widen his reach as a social leader, but also to defend even more passionately his belief that men and women can defeat tyranny by rejecting the poisoned chalice of violence. By the time George Silano filmed Dr. King, the ideology that led to the foundation of the Black Panther Party in October 1966 was already brewing, and the militancy of Black power was starting to attract many youth with its visions of aggressive resistance inspired by movements in Cuba, South Africa, and Algeria. While King found inspiration in Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, St. Augustine's The City of God, and Tolstoy's indictment of how Napoleon's total war led to his ultimate defeat in War and Peace, The Black Power movement admired Che Guevara and drew momentum from Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, which justified armed struggle in the quest for social equality. Merely 10 months before Silano filmed King, Malcolm X had been assassinated in Harlem. It was Malcolm X who had established himself as the fiery voice of the boiling, disenfranchised ghettos and slums, whose inhabitants routinely viewed King as an outsider. Yet, Malcolm X was killed by the very same kind of senseless violence that King viewed as a toxic threat to his and all movements. While King rejected the armed struggle, like Malcolm X, he was deeply affected by the worldwide tensions seeping into the collective conscience of the United States in the 60s. African Americans began to identify and empathize with the struggles of the Third World, especially as the United States increased its brutal war in Vietnam under the pretext of containing communism. Dr. King, of course, was no stranger to violence and the oppression of the state. In March of that same year, 1965, the Voting Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, was met by ferocious police and mob violence that resulted in Bloody Sunday. King was more than aware of the grievances of the working class and poor African Americans who were hostile to the state and fueled the Black Power movement. In fact, at the time of Silano's film, King was expanding his nonviolent vision to a wider social spectrum, hence the historical significance of a film that witnesses an honest thinker, a profound believer, a man of moral ideological integrity in transition from being the key figure of the American civil rights movement to becoming a revolutionary global citizen who would leave an indelible mark in our world. Once the social problem of legal segregation and the political problem of voters' rights had been dealt with, the new frontier was the economic problem of poverty. And Dr. King knew fully well that when it came to poverty, which transcends race in this country, he was embarking on a utopian pursuit that would outlive him, and he was entering into his tragic arc. The revolutionary figure that emerged in 1966 is one we do not regularly see praised or even celebrated on King's birthday or in national monuments. It is in this crucial period, so close to his tragic and untimely death 2.25 years after this interview, that Martin Luther King expands his vision to the social ills that not only oppress African Americans, but all the downtrodden in society. In the late 50s and early 60s, King's movement had been mostly concentrated in the South, but as of 1966, it branched out to the North by setting up a base in Chicago, fighting for housing rights and launching the Poor People's Campaign as a massive assault on the entire culture of poverty. King's physical and spiritual immersion became now the struggle for not just racial and political equality, but also socioeconomic justice. In other words, his profound conviction that justice is indivisible and can only come as a whole package. The great culmination of this period would come on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination, when King delivered a speech at New York's Riverside Church that would firmly place him on the side of the growing anti-war movement and cost him dearly among the political elite. It was here that King addressed issues that were pressing in 1967 and are still poignant today. King denounced the war in Vietnam as an act of imperialist aggression and connected its cruelty to inequality at home, not to mention the surreal incoherence worthy of a Luis Buñuel movie of Dr. King being praised by the establishment for advocating nonviolence domestically, while being condemned for advocating the same nonviolence abroad. For those who criticize him for not focusing on civil rights alone, King's argument was that he had fought too long against segregated public accommodations to end up segregating his own moral concerns. King would also go on to denounce US support of the regimes that ruled Latin America. He demanded that the US instead support the shirtless and barefoot people of the third world and stop being on the wrong side of a world revolution. Doesn't this sound like a call for our own age as the Arab world awakens in revolution and European capitals tremble again at the sound of angry, dispossessed workers and citizens? In a stark warning with harrowing resonance today, King also stated in his Riverside speech that, quote, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." The response by the guardians of opinion was fierce. The Washington Post, for example, slammed King and said that he had diminished his usefulness to his cause, his country, and his people. Can you imagine the Washington Post writing such words about Martin Luther King today? Through it all, Dr. King never once abandoned his principles of nonviolent resistance. The more radical his political and social views became, the stronger he immersed himself in the nonviolent struggle. To understand King's vision of nonviolence, we turn to his own hero, Mahatma Gandhi, whose portrait you will see on the wall in tonight's film. Gandhi's doctrine was one that condemned cowardice as the supreme sin and lifted nonviolence as the most radical form of resistance. Gandhi understood, as King would in time, that to fight a system based on the separation of the races and the oppression of an ethnic group by another, one must provoke a piercing change in the way people think. This will inevitably have an effect on the way people act. Revolutionize the spirit and then re-engineer policies and procedures. For all the virtues of political correctness, which thankfully forces people to mind what they say, there is no guarantee that heads aren't still poisoned by racist thoughts. True change affects the heart, which informs the brain. Dr. King expressed that the real victory of this period was what it did to the psyche of African Americans. Quote, "The victory was that we armed ourselves with dignity and self-respect, that we straightened our backs up, and a man cannot raise his back unless it's bent." In the same way that Gandhi challenged British colonial rule of India without arms, so King would confront America's vast legalized form of racial segregation. For King, Gandhi's vision provided a way of fighting back against oppression without leaving an aftermath of bitterness and hatred, as is usually the case after violent revolutions. The face of retribution that tends to undo all that has been done, only to perpetuate the self-defeating, blinding cycle of an eye for an eye. Instead, nonviolence leaves open the door for vision and real reconciliation. Or as King himself put it, perhaps channeling Gandhi, quote, "I'm talking about a very strong force where you stand up with all your might against an evil system, and you're not a coward, you are resisting." But many have misunderstood both Gandhi and King. We may be inclined to celebrate King over Malcolm X, for instance, because we're fooled into believing that King's rhetoric is safer and therefore more comforting. Not quite so. King, like Gandhi, believed that non-resistance to evil was shameful and that nonviolence was the supreme form of actually pushing back, of fighting against injustice. As Norman Finkelstein documents in his recent study of what Gandhi actually said, as opposed to the myth, Gandhi was disgusted by those who used the mantle of nonviolence as an excuse to hide, or sit and watch as others clashed with state security forces in the street. The call for nonviolence means action, taking the risk of walking towards the gunfire, approaching a tank without fear, even if it means certain death, like that haunting image of a young man confronting a tank in Tiananmen Square in 1989. As we continue to discover more about King's evolution as a social thinker and activist, his legacy resounds in all corners of the globe. King is a key global citizen because his example casts a light over all movements seeking radical change through nonviolence, whether they're based in Oakland or Istanbul, in the West Bank or Kiev. In 1968, the year King was assassinated in Memphis, right before the Olympic Games in my native Mexico, thousands of students demanded government reforms by marching peacefully through the streets, only to be massacred by government troops in Tlatelolco Square. Nonviolent movements have persisted in the United States, spanning and then transcending all racial and class lines to protest the Vietnam War and beyond. In the 1980s, Eastern Europe witnessed the rise of nonviolent resistance against the Soviet Union, which resulted in the fall of the Berlin Wall without a shot being fired. Today, as the world is gripped by an expanding economic crisis, we are seeing nonviolent protests against social inequality sprout in all corners of the world, from the Occupy movement in the United States to the so-called occupation of the squares in Spain, Greece, and Portugal. Voices are growing among both Jewish and Arab groups for a nonviolent movement to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. Just last year, President Obama was forced to retreat from bombing Syria after popular movements demanded a nonviolent resolution to the conflict. These voices understand what the words of Martin Luther King Jr. still say to us like a burning flame in the darkness. Resistance to oppression is an absolute necessity if we are to call ourselves members of the human race. Nonviolence can be and should be our moral force because it challenges, it conquers, and it can heal the profound wounds of the social body without falling into the traps of retribution. It is through King's prism that we can better understand Nelson Mandela emerging in 1990 from 27 years in prison and overcoming apartheid not with revenge, but with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The world is such that when a myth becomes a man, he is often reduced. Tonight, we invite you to watch a film that proves that in the case of Martin Luther King, when the myth gives way to the man, the legacy only grows. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. First, please, a round of applause from Professor Carrasco for that history lesson. And really putting the tonight's event and the legacy of Dr. King into clear perspective. I think we're here tonight because of almost a perfect storm of events that happened. When no became finally yes, 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 yes. And I think it's important to note that it all started with a student, one of Professor Carrasco's students who's here with us tonight. Patricia, will you stand up, please? It was this student who first alerted Professor Carrasco that this film existed and this filmmaker existed. And one thing led to another, and that's why we're here tonight. So students, you are important. Always remember that. It's my great pleasure to be here tonight. I was invited to participate in this by Professor Carrasco. And the Global Council and Kelly Brayton are to be acknowledged as far as support for this event and making it possible for us to be here tonight, and also our college president, Dr. Chui Sang. So thank you very much. In December of 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. opened up his home for the first and only time to a television host, Arnold Michaelis, the legendary interviewer. He spent 4 days recording Dr. King and his wife, Coretta, in a uniquely intimate setting, revealing these historic figures' most private thoughts. This program has never been televised and has remained unseen in the Michaelis Library of Living History at the University of Georgia for over 40 years. Now, filmmaker George Silano, the veteran director-cameraman and the only living member of the team, has rediscovered the film, and I have to acknowledge him as a keeper of the flame, as he has traveled all the way across the country to be with us. There are only, I believe, 1,003 people who have seen this film prior to tonight. No one west of the Mississippi until you guys here tonight. And it's really a tribute to Dr. King's legacy. In many of the things that you've seen of Dr. King, you've never got a chance, I think, to see him really as a man who had a family, who had kids. And this is Dr. King at home, in his suit and tie still. But he's at home, and he's with his family, which is a really, really unique view. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Keeper of the Flame, Mr. George Silano.
Well, I think this is the largest group I've worked with so far. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time about Black history, or I just want to point out a particular period of Martin. By the way, I'm using the term Martin because when I met him and we worked together in his living room, he insisted that I call him Martin and not Dr. King or Reverend King. So forgive me, it's not a sign of disrespect when I say Martin. Okay, I hope you'll appreciate that. And I really fell in love with the guy as well. That's good. Thank you for the lights out. That's good. Now, I'm going to show you a series of three pictures of they're self-explanatory, and it sort of represents the madness that was going on in the early 1900s. In 1964, Martin got a call to come to the White House. Why? To witness the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And there it is. You see Martin standing there. And after President Johnson signed, who did he turn to at first? Is Martin. There he is, look. So you can see the kind of role that he played and how this is the moment that changed the course of history. You're looking right at it, and Martin was the guy who was the driving force.
George, I have a question. You met recently with Oliver Stone, who visited us here at SMC a few months ago. And when he was here, we talked about the possibility of his making a film about Martin Luther King, which he's not making anymore. He actually sent a tweeter saying that he just couldn't cope with the pressure to sanitize the image rather than show the man with all his inherent complexities and so forth. So I'm curious, when you met Oliver, did you sense that it was going that way, that he might end up not making the film?
Oh, yes. I was with him in November. We had lunch together, and I showed him this film that you've seen. And we spent about 3 hours together. And from what he told me, I knew that he was going to walk. But what happened there is that the King children have control over the script. Whoever's going to make a picture about Martin Luther King, they're going to have to deal with the 3 children. And if they don't like the script, it's thumbs down, you're out.
And incidentally, related to what you just said, the children gave the rights of that speech and the images for an internet publicity campaign, which a lot of people think was questionable.
Well, the children get money from that speech. They control it, and anyone who wants to use a portion has to pay certain fees for that.
Got a question right there.
Yeah, I really appreciate you traveling here today and showing us this film. It was really great to see. In the film, you guys mentioned that even with the bombing of his house and the violence that was occurring, you mentioned that you traveled from the hotel to his home. During your travels over those 4 days, did you guys experience any pushback from the white community? Did they find out that you were visiting King's home? Did you guys experience anything that for people who didn't want to make the film?
That's a good question, and maybe we were just blind drunk, but we didn't ever feel. I never felt any kind of threat in Atlanta. I don't know why we didn't, but we just didn't. Maybe it was him that created that feeling of, like I expressed before, like when you're with him, when you're with Martin, it's really amazing how calm. I've never met anybody who felt so comfortable in his own skin as Martin. He was an amazing character, and that just develops and evolves right at you become that.
Why has this film been locked up for 40 years?
Yeah, that's a good question too, because I didn't have a chance to explain it, and I frankly don't know. See, that's the mystery of this thing. Why was it lying on a shelf for over 45 years? Now, through the Freedom of Information Act, we are now able to see the memos that J. Edgar Hoover sent to all his local offices around the world, around the country, how to ruin Martin, how to do it, why we should do it, and do it, right? Now the government was against Martin Luther King, and like you mentioned earlier in your talk, when he made the speech of the Riverside Church in 1967, saying that America was the largest purveyor of violence in the world, he began to touch the third rail. He was planning a 500,000 camp-in Washington until the war was ended in Vietnam. Did you know that? Yeah. So now he's got his both hands and feet on the third rail.
Thank you for the film. It was superlative. And I lived through this, and the film was superlative. Question. I didn't anticipate seeing Coretta Scott King speak so much here and be such an independent person during this time period. How did that evolve in the film?
You've never seen her speaking, right?
No.
About these things?
No.
I found that even on the second viewing to be one of the more fascinating things about this interview was an opportunity to really hear from Coretta Scott King and her views and about her courage and what she faced and how unflinching she was, and how courageous she was.
Also, she was undergoing a lot of pressure at the time. Right before this interview, Hoover had sent her packages with tapes that he had recorded of her husband and so forth. And Hoover was after him just viciously. After the Nobel Prize, Hoover famously declared that this time the Nobel Committee had to dig into the trash very deeply. He said that in a public interview. And a lot of it he was channeling towards the wife. So I think it's even more poignant seeing her courage and the integrity and so forth. And I think we would be naive to think that, there weren't issues among them. King spoke about that himself, saying that he was 28 days a month away from home. But they had a partnership and they had a very solid friendship. And who the hell would we be to judge whatever went on between them, I think.
Let me ask a question of the students in the audience. What lessons do you take from seeing this film?
And I personally took away a sense of defining a purpose. I think that's really important, especially for someone, and I think people our age, we wonder, what we're here for. We wonder what we're here to do. Sometimes we wonder what we're doing in life. And I'm at that point right now. And I think that, King had a purpose. He had something. He was really driven. It was like a tunnel vision. He was willing to die for it.
To answer the question as far as what I got out of this or what students should take from seeing this documentary, I just feel that from viewing this documentary, the biggest thing that I've taken from it is to invest in your beliefs and to always stand up for what you believe in, no matter what, like against all odds, to just stay strong. And most importantly is to educate yourself about what's going on in the world, because Dr. King, it was mentioned in the beginning of the interview that, well, before it got into the interview, that he studied a lot. He wrote books, and he was very aware, not just about his own struggle, but about what was going on in the world. And he remained conscious about that fact. And I think that's very important for us as students to remain conscious and aware of not just our own personal struggles, but everyone else's, and to stand up for what we believe in no matter what.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Where's the microphone? There it is.
Were there other people supporting Dr. King besides Belafonte?
There was really a broad base of support for Dr. King that came from a lot of different areas at that time. Somebody talked about some of the similarities between today and back at that time. There was a lot of really strong support from the entertainment community. A lot of celebrities went on the marches along with Dr. King. And as you see some of the documentaries of that time, you see a lot of the most popular celebrities at that time who were with Dr. King. A lot of religious support across the board as far as all religions are concerned. A lot of support for Dr. King at that time. It cut across cultural and racial lines. There was really, really a broad base of support, more broad than the media would let you see at that time as well. So that's interesting. We always talk about the media giving us a frame in which to watch the world through, but there are people who control what's in that frame. And we don't ask the questions enough of what's not in the frame. And so a lot of times there was a lot more support for Dr. King and what he was doing at that time than the media allowed the American public to believe.
What about spreading this movie now? I mean, Professor Dawson had said something about, well, we didn't have Twitter in the 60s, but we do now, and we have YouTube. I think people would love this movie. What about spreading it viral and seeing just all those millions of those Martin Luther King fans picking up and running with this and using it as inspiration?
You need to talk about why the film can't be widely distributed at this point.
That's a good question, yeah. It's owned by the archive people, and it's now all that footage that I shot, which was deteriorating very badly after 40 years. You know, it was 16 millimeter black and white film, not carefully taken care of with humidity and temperature. So now all that film that I shot is now in Hollywood, being digitized. Yeah, and preserved. And Andrew Young found the money. A lot of people donated money to, that's a very expensive process, and that's the stage that it's in now. But when that footage comes back, it's going to look gorgeous. You know, this, what you saw tonight, was what we call a work print.
Do you know if the outtakes survived? Because
everything is survived. It's all, that's why they want me to come back and give them a treatment to make a better version of what you saw.
So they're restoring everything digitally, including the outtakes.
Yeah, everything I haven't, a lot of it I haven't seen, right? Only what you saw tonight is all I've seen.
My name is Tom. What was Dr. King's internal motivation? What made him excel, like, you know, thoroughly? Was it his beliefs? Was it the Bible? Was it, you know, was it for the community? Like, what was it?
There were a lot of people involved, but with him, he was more special than the average person. And you can see that, right? You understand? If you knew the crosshairs were on you, you'd go home and read the paper, right? There's a certain point where you'd stop and say, okay, that's enough. I'm going home. Thank you very much, right? But not Martin.
My question is, how did you get the word that Dr. King passed? And what were your initial thoughts? I'm right here.
Oh, hello.
Hi. This has been an amazing experience for me, by the way, for all of us. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm very proud of this group. I mean, for all the groups that I've presented the film, this group here is very special because you're all still here. And I really appreciate that. That's amazing. It really is amazing. Well, look, since I'm calling him Martin, you can imagine When you're working like we did, with so much interplay, talking together, having lunch together, and it's extremely sad what I felt. It's just a very tough thing. Because the thing is, if you think about it, I don't know of any other personality. You may know more than I do, but I don't know anybody that I've known except for Nelson Mandela, who was at that level. It's all about money, right? Now everything is dysfunctional and money related, and all those televangelists, they're worth tens of millions of dollars, but you never saw a pinky ring on Martin.
So just to share one final thought out loud, I was thinking right now of the question you asked, and I'm sorry I don't know your name. I think you answered it. So a student answered another student's question very eloquently, I think, because what motivated him, Dr. King, seems to have been just this believing in something profoundly. And I think that's what many of us are losing touch with, because we compromise and we become skeptical and cynical, and we think it's okay to compromise because there's time tomorrow to have the profound beliefs. It's a conversation I often have with my students, that they feel, well, right now, there will be time for that later on. And I hope it's something that we all take from this film, that in that sense, there is no tomorrow. We need to have those profound beliefs yesterday, because you never know if there is a tomorrow to begin with. And today might be the day where your life is changed forever. And it's something that I often wonder about. What does it really mean to believe in something profoundly? And I don't think religion is the problem. You can see it here. It's just the stupid things we do in the name of religion often. But here's a man who was obviously profoundly religious, who went back to the essence of Christianity. I think his interpretation of Christianity is humanistic, it's universal. It's not segregating other belief systems, it's just making it one voice for everyone, and who could possibly find fault with that? I guess only Hoover. So this is tremendously inspiring, and we really thank you, George, for sharing this with us.
Thank you.
My soul back and wonder, how did I make it over?